Naomi Carter did everything right, graduating at the top of her class in Chicago with a college dream within reach. But days later, her father lost both legs in a factory accident, and the company denied everything. No help. No justice. Naomi gave up college to survive, taking exhausting jobs, often unpaid, silently enduring unfair treatment just to keep her family alive. Then, one day, she stepped into a powerful home, and for the first time someone truly saw her. What they uncovered would change everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Chicago, early summer. The morning sun stretched across rows of brick buildings, casting warm light over a high school football field turned into a graduation venue. A gentle breeze carried the distant hum of the city. Cars, voices, life moving forward, while rows of chairs filled with families shimmered under the bright sky. Naomi Carter stood among her classmates, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of her graduation gown. Naomi was 18, medium height, slim but resilient in build, with smooth, deep brown skin that glowed under the sunlight. Her face was softly oval, framed by tightly coiled black hair pulled into a neat low bun. Her dark brown eyes were steady, observant, eyes that had learned early how to read people, how to stay composed, even when life was uncertain. She carried herself with quiet dignity, shaped by years of watching her parents struggle but never complain. Today, though, there was something different in her posture: hope. Her name was called. Naomi Carter. The applause rose around her, but it sounded distant, like it was happening somewhere far away. She walked forward, each step measured, controlled. When she shook the principal's hand, she allowed herself a small smile. Not for the crowd, but for the people sitting in the third row. David Carter sat at the edge of his seat, clapping harder than anyone else. He was a man in his early 50s, tall but slightly worn by years of labor. His once broad shoulders had begun to slope from decades of factory work. His hands, large, rough, marked with scars, rested awkwardly on his knees between bursts of applause. His skin was deep brown, his hair short and graying at the temples. His eyes, however, were alive, filled with pride, with something almost fragile. David had spent over 25 years working at the same manufacturing plant on the south side of Chicago. He was known among co-workers as quiet but dependable, a man who never missed a shift, never argued, never asked for more than what he was given. What shaped him most was not hardship, but responsibility. When Naomi was born, he had made a silent promise to himself: his children would not live the same life he did. Beside him sat Lillian Carter, Naomi's mother. Lillian was in her late 40s, small in frame, with delicate features softened by years of quiet endurance. Her skin carried a gentle warmth, though her face showed signs of long-term illness, slight paleness, a constant fatigue behind her eyes. Her dark hair was wrapped neatly in a scarf, and she sat carefully, as if conserving every bit of strength she had. Despite her condition, her smile never faded when she looked at Naomi. Her illness had shaped the family in ways no one spoke about openly. It had forced Naomi to grow up faster, to become attentive, responsible, but it had also given her a deep sense of empathy, something that showed in everything she did. Next to them, two younger children leaned forward eagerly. Ethan Carter, 12 years old, was tall for his age, with a slim build and restless energy. His short curls framed a face that still carried traces of childhood softness. He admired Naomi more than anyone, though he rarely said it out loud. Maya Carter, only 9, was small and observant, with wide dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. She clutched a handmade sign that read, "We love you, Naomi," written in uneven letters. As Naomi stepped down from the stage, she found them. For a moment, the noise faded completely. "You did it," David said, his voice thick. Almost unsteady, Naomi nodded, holding back tears. "We did." Because she knew this moment didn't belong to her alone. Later that afternoon, the family gathered outside their modest home in a quiet neighborhood. The house was small, slightly worn, but clean and full of care. A folding table had been set up in the yard with simple food, homemade dishes, nothing extravagant, but prepared with love. Among the guests was Alicia Reynolds. Alicia was Naomi's closest friend. 18, average height, with light brown skin and long, loosely curled hair that fell over her shoulders. Her style was effortless, her energy bright and expressive. Where Naomi was quiet and measured, Alicia was open, quick to laugh, quick to speak her mind. She had grown up in a more stable household, but she never took that stability for granted. What shaped Alicia most was her belief in possibility. She saw the world as something to step into, not something to endure. "You better not back out now," Alicia said, nudging Naomi playfully. "That school sent you a letter for a reason." Naomi smiled faintly, holding the envelope in her hand. The university's crest was printed clearly on the front. "I'm not backing out," she said, but her voice carried hesitation, so subtle that only Alicia noticed. "You're going," Alicia insisted, softer now. "You've worked too hard for this." Naomi looked toward her father, who was laughing with a neighbor, his shoulders relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in years. "I want to," she said quietly. And she meant it. The days that followed felt almost unreal. Naomi began preparing for college, filling out forms, reviewing the course materials, imagining a future that felt just within reach. For the first time, life seemed to be opening instead of closing in. David watched her from a distance, often saying little, but his pride was unmistakable. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft orange hues, he stood beside her on the front steps. "You're going to go further than I ever did," he said. Naomi shook her head. "I'm only here because of you." David smiled faintly. "No, you're here because you didn't give up." There was a pause, then he added, almost to himself, "That's something no one can take from you." 3 days later, everything changed. It was early morning. The city hadn't fully woken yet when Naomi heard the knock at the door. Sharp. Urgent. When she opened it, 2 men stood outside, one in a factory uniform, the other in plain clothes. There had been an accident. David Carter had been injured on the job. The world seemed to tilt. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and silence. Naomi moved quickly down the hallway, her heart pounding, her thoughts scattered. When she reached the room, she hesitated for just a second before pushing the door open. David lay on the bed, unnaturally still. Machines hummed softly around him. His face was pale, his eyes half open, struggling to focus. "Dad," Naomi whispered. He turned his head slightly, recognizing her. There was relief in his expression. And pain. Naomi's gaze dropped, and everything inside her froze. The blanket over his lower body lay flat in a way it shouldn't. Too flat. A doctor stepped forward, Dr. Michael Harris, mid-30s, average build, short dark hair, calm but guarded expression. He spoke with professionalism, but there was a distance in his tone, as if he had delivered news like this too many times before. "I'm sorry," he said. "The injuries were severe. We had no choice." Naomi didn't hear the rest. The words echoed in her mind, over and over. No choice. Outside the room, voices murmured. 2 men in suits stood near the end of the hallway, speaking in low tones. One of them glanced toward Naomi briefly before looking away. There was something uneasy about the way they carried themselves, as if they were already moving on. Further down the corridor, a young man stood alone, holding a folder tightly in his hands. His name was Daniel Brooks. He appeared to be in his late 20s, tall and lean, with neatly styled dark hair and sharp, attentive eyes. He wore a simple suit, not expensive, but clean and professional. His expression was serious, but not cold. There was something else there, something thoughtful, observant. He watched the hallway quietly, as if trying to understand more than what was being said. A junior attorney, new to the field, still someone who believed the truth mattered. For a brief moment, his eyes met Naomi's, and then he looked down at the file again. Inside the room, Naomi sat beside her father, her hand wrapped around his. Everything that had once felt certain now felt fragile. The acceptance letter, the future, the dream. Still there, but slipping. The hospital days did not pass the way Naomi expected. They dragged, heavy and suffocating, each hour stretching longer than the last. Outside, Chicago continued moving as it always did. Cars rushing past, people hurrying to work, the rhythm of a city that never paused for anyone's pain. But inside that small hospital room, time felt frozen. David Carter no longer looked like the man who had sat proudly in the third row just days before. He was still tall, still broad in the shoulders, but something had changed in the way he held himself. His strength, once quiet and steady, now seemed fragile, like it could break under the weight of what had happened. He spoke less. When he did, his voice carried a hesitation Naomi had never heard before. Naomi stayed by his side as much as she could, learning quickly how to adjust pillows, how to help him sit, how to pretend everything would be okay. But nothing felt okay. A week after the accident, a letter arrived. It was delivered not by mail, but by a man in a pressed gray suit who stood at the doorway of their home as if he did not belong there. His name was Richard Coleman. Richard Coleman was in his mid-40s, tall, thin, with pale skin and neatly combed dark hair streaked lightly with gray. His face was sharp, almost expressionless, and his voice carried a tone of controlled politeness that felt distant rather than respectful. He had worked for the factory for years, not as a laborer but as part of its management. People like him did not lift heavy machines. They made decisions. And those decisions rarely favored people like David Carter. "I'm here on behalf of the company," he said, holding out an envelope. Naomi stood in the doorway, her posture firm despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "What is it?" she asked. "Official documentation," he replied, "regarding Mr. Harding, Carter's employment status and the findings of the internal review." There was something rehearsed in the way he spoke, something final. Naomi took the envelope slowly. Richard did not step inside. "I'm sorry for your situation," he added, though nothing in his tone suggested he truly was. "But the company has concluded that the accident resulted from a violation of safety procedures." Naomi's grip tightened slightly. "That's not true." Richard met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "The report is final." And with that, he left. Inside the envelope, the words felt colder than anything Naomi had experienced before. No compensation, termination of employment, liability denied. David Carter, who had given more than half his life to that factory, was now being blamed for the very accident that took everything from him. The shift in their home was immediate. Lillian Carter, already weak from years of illness, began to fade further. Her movements slowed, her voice softer, her energy nearly gone. She spent more time lying down, her body no longer able to keep up with the weight of stress. Naomi noticed the small changes, the way her mother's hands trembled when she tried to sit up, the way she sometimes stared quietly at nothing, as if trying to gather strength she no longer had. Lillian had always been gentle, but now she seemed fragile in a way that frightened Naomi. One evening, as the light dimmed through the window, Lillian reached for Naomi's hand. "You should still go," she said softly. Naomi shook her head immediately. "Mom, don't." "You worked for it," Lillian continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let this take it away from you." Naomi forced a small smile. "It's not going anywhere," she said, but deep down, she already knew. Alicia Reynolds called that same week. Her voice came through bright at first, filled with excitement. "I got my dorm assignment," Alicia said. "You won't believe how small the room is, but I don't even care. It's real, Naomi. It's actually happening." Naomi listened quietly, leaning against the kitchen counter. "That's amazing," she said. Alicia paused. "You haven't sent yours in yet, have you?" Naomi hesitated. "Things are complicated right now." Alicia's tone softened instantly. "Because of your dad," Naomi nodded, even though Alicia couldn't see her. "I might just defer," she said, "just for a while." There was silence on the other end. "You're still going," Alicia said gently, but firmly. "You have to." Naomi looked toward the hallway, where she could hear her father shifting in his room. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. The distance between them wasn't physical, not yet, but it had begun. 2 days later, Naomi returned to the hospital, not as a visitor but with questions. She found Dr. Harris near the nurses' station. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Dr. Michael Harris looked up, recognizing her immediately. His expression softened slightly, though the guarded professionalism remained. "Of course." "Was it really his fault?" Naomi asked. There was a pause. Dr. Harris glanced briefly down the hallway before responding. "I'm not involved in the investigation," he said carefully, "but the injuries—" He hesitated. They were consistent with equipment failure. Naomi's heart tightened. Then why are they saying he caused it? Dr. Harris didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "You should speak with someone who understands these cases." That someone appeared again, sooner than she expected. Daniel Brooks stood near the hospital exit, holding the same folder Naomi had seen before. This time, when he saw her, he didn't look away. He stepped forward. "Naomi Carter?" he asked. His voice was calm, respectful. Naomi nodded cautiously. "My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm a junior attorney." He adjusted the folder in his hands. "I've been reviewing cases related to workplace injuries." Naomi crossed her arms slightly. "And? I believe your father's case may not have been handled properly." There it was, the truth, spoken plainly. Naomi felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in days. Hope. "Can you help us?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. His appearance was neat but modest. His suit slightly worn at the edges, his shoes polished but not new. He wasn't someone with power. Not yet. "I want to," he said honestly, "but cases like this, they require time, resources, filing fees, investigations." Naomi understood before he finished. Money, something they no longer had. "I see," she said quietly. Daniel looked at her, something conflicted in his expression. "I'm sorry." Naomi nodded once. "Thank you for trying." And just like that, the brief spark disappeared. The decision came that night. Naomi sat alone at the small kitchen table, the acceptance letter laid out in front of her. The university seal gleamed under the dim light. Still felt real. Still within reach, but now it felt like something meant for someone else. She picked up a pen. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she began to write. A request to defer enrollment. Not a rejection, just a delay, but even as she wrote it, she knew the truth. Some delays become endings. The next morning, Naomi woke up earlier than usual. She tied her hair back tightly, put on a simple shirt and worn jeans, and stepped out into the city. Not as a student preparing for college, but as someone searching for work. The streets looked different now. Less full of possibility. More full of urgency. The first place she tried was a small grocery store on the corner. The manager, a heavy-set man named Frank Doyle, stood behind the counter. He was in his 50s, with thinning hair and a tired expression that suggested years of dealing with more problems than he cared to solve. He looked Naomi up and down briefly. "We're not hiring full-time," he said. "Part-time is fine," Naomi replied quickly. Frank shrugged. "Come in tomorrow morning. Stocking shelves?" No interview, no questions. Just work. Naomi nodded. "Thank you." It wasn't much, but it was something. That evening, she stood in the doorway of her home, watching the fading light settle over the street. Inside, her family moved quietly, each of them adjusting in their own way to a future none of them had chosen. Naomi took a deep breath. The dream was still there, but it was no longer hers to reach, not now, not anymore. 2 years passed, not in moments, but in weight. Chicago no longer felt like a city of movement to Naomi Carter. It felt like a place that tested how long a person could endure without breaking. Seasons came and went, but for Naomi, time was measured differently now. By shifts worked, by bills unpaid, by nights spent counting what little remained. David Carter was gone. He had held on longer than anyone expected. His body weakened, but his spirit stubborn. In his final months, he spoke less, but when he did, it was always about the same thing: his children. Naomi remembered the last time he looked at her, not with fear, but with quiet apology, as if he believed he had left too much behind for her to carry. The funeral had been small. There was no money for anything more. A few neighbors came. Alicia sent flowers from her university dorm. Naomi stood still through it all, her face composed, her hands steady, her grief locked somewhere deep where it wouldn't interfere with what needed to be done next. Because there was always something that needed to be done next. Naomi was 20 now. She had grown thinner, not from lack of food alone, but from the constant demand of survival. Her once soft features had sharpened slightly, her movements more efficient, her expressions more controlled. Her hair remained tied back in the same low bun, practical, unchanging. Her eyes, once filled with quiet hope, had become something else. Focused. Measured. Tired, but unbroken. She worked wherever she could. Morning shifts at the grocery store with Frank Doyle continued for a while, but the pay was barely enough to cover basic expenses. Soon, Naomi began taking on additional jobs, anything available. At a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, she worked under a supervisor named Luis Ortega. Luis was in his early 40s, medium height with a solid build, his skin tanned from years of physical labor. He had short, dark hair, a trimmed beard, and eyes that carried a constant alertness. Unlike others, Luis wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He had learned through years of hardship that survival required distance. "Don't slow down," he would say, not harshly, but without sympathy. "You fall behind. Someone else takes your spot." Naomi nodded every time. She lifted boxes heavier than she should have, her arms trembling by the end of each shift. Her back ached constantly, but she never complained, because complaining meant replacement, and replacement meant no income. In the evenings, she worked at a small diner downtown. The owner, Martha Green, was a woman in her late 50s, short, slightly heavy-set with tightly curled gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Martha had built the diner from nothing after her husband passed away years ago, and that loss had hardened her. She respected hard work, but she valued profit more. "You break a plate, it comes out of your pay," Martha said on Naomi's first day. Naomi nodded. "And don't expect overtime," Martha added. "You stay longer, that's on you." Naomi nodded again. At first, the customers blurred together, faces, orders, voices. But over time, certain patterns became clear. Some treated her with quiet respect, others barely looked at her, and some saw her as invisible. One night, after a long shift, Naomi approached Martha about her pay. "I worked extra hours this week," she said carefully. Martha didn't look up from her register. "You got paid for your shift." "I stayed 3 hours after closing." "You weren't scheduled," Martha replied flatly. Naomi hesitated. "I was told to stay." Martha finally looked at her. "Then you should have asked who was going to pay you." There was no anger in her tone, just indifference. Naomi stood there for a moment. Then she nodded. "I understand." And she walked away. This became her life. Work, silence, endurance. She learned quickly that fairness was not guaranteed, that effort did not always equal reward, that sometimes the only way to survive was to accept what was given, even when it wasn't enough. At home, things were no easier. Lillian Carter remained weak, her condition unchanged, her energy limited. She tried to help where she could, but most days even small movements exhausted her. Ethan Carter had grown taller, now 14. his shoulders beginning to broaden, his voice deeper. But his eyes carried something new: frustration. "I can work," he said one evening, standing in the small living room. "I'm not a kid anymore." Naomi looked at him sharply. "You're staying in school." "That's not helping us right now," Ethan shot back. "It will." "No, it won't," he said, his voice rising. "You're doing everything, and it's still not enough." The words hung in the air. Naomi stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "You think I don't know that?" Ethan hesitated. "You think I don't see what's happening?" she continued. "That's exactly why you're staying in school. Because if you quit now, then none of this means anything." Ethan looked away, his jaw tight. "I just don't want you doing this alone." Naomi softened slightly. "I'm not alone," she said, but they both knew the truth. She was. Alicia Reynolds remained in her life, but differently. Their calls became less frequent, shorter, more careful. Alicia spoke about classes, internships, new experiences, things Naomi once dreamed of. Naomi listened, always supportive, always encouraging. But there were moments of silence now, moments where neither of them knew what to say. "I wish things were different," Alicia said during one call. Naomi smiled faintly. "They will be," she replied. But not yet. The worst came from someone Naomi had trusted. His name was Derek Collins. Derek was in his early 30s, tall and lean, with neatly styled hair and a confident smile that made him seem more reliable than he truly was. He spoke smoothly, always appearing helpful, always offering solutions. Naomi met him through a temporary job. He claimed to know people who could connect her to better work opportunities. "You don't belong in those jobs," Derek told her. "You're smart. You just need the right door." Naomi hesitated. "What kind of door?" "Office work, stable hours, better pay," he said. "I can get you in, but there's a processing fee." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a chance. Naomi gave him what little savings she had. It wasn't much, but it was everything she could risk. Derek took the money and disappeared. No job, no contact, nothing. Naomi didn't cry. Not when she realized what had happened. Not when she checked her phone again and again, hoping for a message that never came. She simply sat still. Then, the next morning, she got up and went back to work. Because she didn't have the luxury of breaking. Late one night, after another long shift, Naomi walked home through quiet streets. The city lights flickered above her, casting long shadows across the pavement. Her steps were slow. Her body exhausted. But her mind steady. She had learned something over these 2 years. The world could take a lot from you: dreams, time, fairness, but it couldn't take everything, not unless you let it. Naomi stopped for a moment, looking up at the skyline. Her dream of college felt distant now, faded but not gone, just waiting. And until that day came, if it ever did, she would keep going. Quietly, relentlessly, without expecting anything in return. The city felt colder that morning, even though summer hadn't quite ended. Naomi Carter stood outside a tall iron gate, her fingers lightly gripping the strap of her worn bag. The address on the small piece of paper in her hand matched the number engraved into the stone pillar beside her. This was it. The Whitmore residence. The property stretched farther than she expected. Manicured lawns, tall trees trimmed with precision, and a large white house standing quietly in the distance like something out of a different world. It wasn't just wealth, it was control, order, stability. Everything Naomi's life had not been for a long time. She hesitated before pressing the intercom. A soft voice responded, calm and clear. "Yes?" "I'm here about the part-time work," Naomi said. There was a brief pause. "Please come in." The gate opened slowly. Naomi stepped forward. Inside, everything felt quiet, not empty, but peaceful. The floors were polished wood, the air lightly scented, the walls decorated with framed photographs that told stories of a life built over time, not rushed into existence. Naomi moved carefully, as if afraid her presence might disturb something. A woman approached from the far end of the hallway. Margaret Whitmore. She appeared to be in her early 50s, tall and slender, with fair skin and carefully styled blonde hair that rested just above her shoulders. Her posture was straight, her movements measured. Her face carried refined features, sharp cheekbones, soft lips, but what stood out most were her eyes. They were observant, not cold, but attentive in a way that missed nothing. Margaret had been raised in a world of expectation and discipline. Her father had been a judge, her mother a socialite known for strict standards. From a young age, Margaret learned how to read people, not just what they said, but what they didn't say. Over time, that ability became instinct. "You must be Naomi," she said. Her voice was calm, without superiority. Naomi nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret studied her for a brief moment, not her clothes, not her posture, but her expression. "Come with me." They moved into a large kitchen, sunlight spilling across marble counters. It was clean, organized, everything in its place. "We're looking for someone to assist with basic household tasks," Margaret said. "Cleaning, occasional errands, helping where needed." Naomi listened carefully. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You don't need to call me that," she said. "Margaret is fine." Naomi hesitated. "Yes, Margaret." There was a brief silence. Margaret continued. "Tell me about yourself." Naomi paused. She had answered that question many times before, but the answer always felt incomplete. "I work multiple jobs," she said. "I learned quickly. I don't complain." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in thought. "That's not what I asked." Naomi blinked. Margaret folded her hands lightly. "I asked about you." There it was again. That difference. Naomi swallowed. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said more slowly. "I finished high school with honors. I was supposed to go to college, but—" She stopped. Margaret didn't interrupt. But things changed. Another pause. Margaret nodded once. "Everyone has a story," she said quietly. "What matters is how they carry it." She turned slightly. "You can start tomorrow." Naomi blinked. "That's it?" Margaret allowed a faint smile. "That's it." Naomi walked out of the house later that day with something unfamiliar settling in her chest. Not relief, not excitement, something quieter. Possibility. Her first day began early. She arrived before the sun fully rose, her steps steady but cautious. Inside, the house was already awake. Soft sounds of movement, distant voices. The quiet rhythm of a place that functioned smoothly. A man stood near the living room window, reading a newspaper. Edward Whitmore. He was in his late 50s, tall with a solid build that suggested both strength and control. His silver hair was neatly combed. His face marked by years of experience rather than age alone. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. Used to making decisions, used to being listened to. Edward had built much of his success himself. While his family name carried weight, it was his discipline and calculated thinking that expanded it. He valued efficiency, clarity, and above all, integrity. He lowered the newspaper slightly when Naomi entered. "You must be Naomi," he said. "Yes, sir." Edward nodded once. "Margaret speaks highly of you." Naomi wasn't sure how to respond to that. "Thank you." He studied her briefly, not in the way others had, not measuring worth, but assessing character. "Do your work well," he said simply. "That's all that matters here." Naomi nodded. "I will." Throughout the day, Naomi moved through the house, completing tasks carefully, precisely. She cleaned, organized, carried out instructions without hesitation. But something felt different. No one rushed her unnecessarily. No one raised their voice. No one treated her like she was invisible. It was unfamiliar. Around midday, she stepped into the garden to clear a small table. A young man sat there, reviewing something on a tablet. Daniel Whitmore. He was 25, tall and lean, with a composed presence that mirrored his father but softened by something quieter. His dark brown hair was neatly styled, his features sharp but not severe. His eyes, steady, thoughtful, carried a kind of awareness that suggested he paid attention to details others missed. Daniel had grown up in privilege, but not in ignorance. His mother had taught him early to observe, to listen, to understand people beyond their surface. It shaped him into someone who spoke less, but noticed more. He glanced up as Naomi approached. "You're new," he said. Naomi nodded. "Yes." Daniel set his tablet aside. "You've been here since early morning." "Yes." "No breaks?" Naomi hesitated. "I'm used to it." Daniel studied her for a moment. "That's not the same thing," he said. Naomi didn't respond. He didn't push. Instead, he said, "There's water inside. You should take a break." It wasn't an order. It was a suggestion. Naomi nodded slowly. "Thank you." As she walked away, Daniel's gaze followed her, not out of curiosity but recognition. He had seen people like her before, but not many who carried themselves the way she did. Days passed. Naomi adjusted. She learned the rhythm of the house, the expectations, the quiet structure that held everything together. But more than that, she began to notice something else. Margaret observed everything. Not obviously, but consistently. She watched how Naomi handled tasks, how she spoke, how she responded to small challenges. There was no criticism, only quiet attention. One afternoon, as Naomi arranged books in the study, Margaret entered. "You move carefully," Margaret said. Naomi paused. "I try to." Margaret nodded. "Not because you're afraid of making mistakes," she said, "but because you're thinking ahead." Naomi wasn't sure what to say. "That's a strength," Margaret added. It was the first time someone had described her that way. Not as hardworking, not as reliable, but as something more. At home, small changes began to appear. Naomi spoke differently now, not louder, but clearer, more certain. Ethan noticed it first. "You sound like them," he said one evening. Naomi frowned slightly. "Like who?" "Those people you work for." Naomi considered that. "I'm just learning," she said. Ethan nodded slowly. For the first time in a long time, he didn't argue. The work was still work, but it no longer felt like survival alone. It felt like something building, something shifting. Naomi didn't know what it was yet, but she could feel it. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began quietly, like most important things do. Naomi Carter had been working at the Whitmore residence for several weeks when Margaret first asked the question that changed everything. It was late afternoon, the house filled with soft golden light. Naomi was in the study, carefully organizing documents into labeled folders, her movements precise and deliberate. Margaret stood near the doorway, watching, not intrusively, but with the same quiet awareness Naomi had grown used to. "You've done this before," Margaret said. Naomi glanced up. "Organizing?" Margaret shook her head slightly. "Responsibility?" Naomi paused. "I've had to," she said simply. Margaret stepped further into the room. "Tell me about your family." There was no pressure in her voice, no expectation, just curiosity. Naomi hesitated at first. She wasn't used to being asked, not like this. But something about Margaret's presence made it easier. So she spoke, not all at once, but steadily, about her father, the factory, the accident, the letter, the silence that followed. Margaret didn't interrupt. When Naomi finished, the room felt heavier. Margaret's expression didn't change dramatically, but her eyes did. There was something sharper there now, focused. "That shouldn't have happened," she said quietly. Naomi gave a faint, almost tired smile. "It did." Margaret held her gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded. "Thank you for telling me." That evening, Margaret spoke to Edward. They sat in the living room, the city lights faint in the distance beyond large glass windows. Edward listened without interruption, his posture still, his fingers resting lightly on the arm of his chair. When Margaret finished, there was a long silence. Edward leaned back slightly. "Which company?" he asked. Margaret gave the name. Edward's expression shifted, not visibly to most, but enough. "I know them," he said. Of course he did. Edward Whitmore knew many companies in Chicago, not casually but structurally. His business dealings, partnerships, and networks extended into sectors most people never saw. Manufacturing was one of them. "They've had issues before," he added. Margaret looked at him. "Then you know what this means?" Edward nodded slowly. "It means we need facts." The investigation began quietly. Edward didn't announce anything. He didn't involve Naomi, not yet. Instead, he reached out to someone he trusted. Charles Bennett. Charles was in his early 60s, a former safety inspector turned private consultant. He was of average height, slightly stooped with age, his gray hair thinning but his eyes still sharp and alert. Years of investigating industrial accidents had left him with a habit of noticing details others overlooked, and a reputation for refusing to ignore inconvenient truths. "I don't take cases for sympathy," Charles said over the phone. Edward replied calmly, "Good. Then take this one for the truth." Charles agreed. Days later, Charles stood inside the factory where David Carter had worked. The environment felt wrong, not visibly dangerous, but controlled in a way that suggested something had been adjusted. Machines recently serviced. Reports recently updated. Too clean. Charles moved slowly, observing, asking questions that seemed simple, but weren't. What was the maintenance schedule for this equipment? Who signed off on the last inspection? Where's the incident report filed before the internal review? Answers came, but not easily and not consistently. Back at the Whitmore residence, Naomi noticed the change before she understood it. Edward had become more focused, his movements more deliberate. Margaret's quiet observation had shifted into something more active, and Daniel was watching her differently now, not out of curiosity, but concern. One evening, as Naomi finished cleaning the dining area, Daniel approached. "You've been working a lot," he said. Naomi gave a small nod. "I'm used to it." Daniel leaned slightly against the table, his posture relaxed but his gaze steady. "You don't have to be," he said. Naomi looked at him. "That's not really how it works." Daniel considered that. "No," he said, "it's not how it's supposed to work either." There was a pause. Naomi studied him. Not his words, but his tone. "You believe that?" she asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes." Something in her expression softened. Just slightly. The truth came a week later. Edward called Naomi into the study. She stood near the doorway at first, unsure. "You wanted to see me?" Edward gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Naomi hesitated, then did. Margaret stood beside the desk. Daniel was near the window, arms crossed loosely. This wasn't about work. Naomi felt it immediately. Edward placed a file on the table. "We looked into your father's case," he said. Naomi's breath caught. "You didn't have to." "Yes," Edward said calmly. "We did." He opened the file. "What we found." He paused briefly. "Your father was not responsible for the accident." Naomi didn't move. "The equipment failed," he continued. "There were prior reports ignored, maintenance was delayed, safety procedures were not followed by the company." The words landed slowly, carefully, as if her mind needed time to accept them. "They knew," Naomi said quietly. Edward nodded. "And they covered it up." Silence filled the room. Then Margaret spoke. "That's not the end of it," she said, "because now it becomes a case." Naomi looked up. "A case?" Edward closed the file. "You deserve justice," he said. The next step came quickly. Daniel made a call. Not to a large firm, not to someone distant, but to someone who had been there from the beginning. Daniel Brooks. Daniel Brooks arrived at the Whitmore residence 2 days later, standing in the same hallway where Naomi now worked. He looked different, but not because of his appearance. His suit was still modest, his posture still composed. But there was something more certain in his expression now. When he saw Naomi, he paused. "I didn't expect," he began. Naomi gave a small, surprised smile. "Me neither." Edward stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "we understand you reviewed this case previously." Daniel nodded. "I did, but I didn't have the resources to pursue it." Edward gestured toward the study. "You do now." The case reopened. This time with evidence, with support, with pressure the company could not easily ignore. Daniel worked closely with Charles Bennett, reviewing documents, building a timeline, identifying inconsistencies. For the first time, the truth wasn't just known. It was being prepared to be proven. Meanwhile, something else began to repair itself. Alicia Reynolds called again. This time, her voice was different, not distant, not rushed. "I heard what's happening," she said. Naomi leaned against the wall, holding the phone tighter. "Yeah." Alicia hesitated. "I should have been there more." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. "You had your life. That doesn't mean I stopped being your friend." Silence. Then Naomi smiled. Genuinely this time. "I know." Alicia exhaled softly. "I want to help," she said, "whatever you need." And just like that, the distance between them began to close. Late one evening, Naomi stood outside in the Whitmore garden. The air was cool, the city quiet in the distance. Daniel joined her. "Big changes," he said. Naomi nodded slowly. "I don't know how to feel yet." "That's fair." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Because someone should have." Naomi held his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But something passed between them, unspoken, but understood. Trust. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, the truth was no longer hidden, and Naomi was no longer alone. The courtroom felt colder than Naomi expected, not physically, but emotionally. It was a large federal building in downtown Chicago, its high ceilings echoing every movement, every whispered conversation, every shift of paper. Rows of wooden benches stretched across the room, filled with observers who had come not just for a case, but for what it represented. Naomi Carter sat quietly beside Daniel Brooks, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple, well-fitted blazer Margaret had helped her choose, nothing extravagant but dignified. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, but inside everything felt suspended, waiting. Daniel Brooks sat next to her, composed as always. Today he carried himself differently, not just as a junior attorney trying to prove something, but as someone who knew exactly what was at stake. His dark hair was neatly styled, his tie perfectly aligned, but his eyes were focused, not on appearances but on outcome. Across the room sat the representatives of the factory. Among them was Richard Coleman. He looked exactly the same as before. Sharp suit, controlled posture, expression unreadable. But there was tension in the way he held his shoulders now. The confidence he once carried so effortlessly had shifted into something tighter, less certain. Because this time he wasn't delivering a decision. He was defending one. The judge entered. Judge Eleanor Whitman. She was in her early 60s, tall with a composed presence that commanded immediate respect. Her silver-gray hair was cut short and practical, her face marked by years of experience rather than softness. Her eyes were sharp, precise, used to weighing truth against argument without distraction. She had built her reputation on fairness. Not sympathy, not influence. Fairness. "Proceed," she said. The case unfolded methodically. Daniel stood, presenting evidence piece by piece. His voice was steady, not overly dramatic, not rushed. He didn't try to impress the courtroom. He focused on clarity. Maintenance reports were filed and ignored, he stated. Inspection schedules were delayed. Internal communications show awareness of equipment failure risk prior to the incident. Documents were passed forward. Screens displayed records. Each detail built upon the last. Charles Bennett testified next, his voice firm despite his age. I've reviewed hundreds of cases, he said. This one is clear. The failure was not sudden, it was preventable. The opposing counsel attempted to push back, introducing arguments about procedural oversight, about human error. But the evidence didn't bend. It held. Naomi was called to the stand. For a moment, the room seemed to quiet. She stood, walking forward with measured steps, her breathing controlled. When she sat, she placed her hands together, steady, just as she had practiced. Daniel approached gently. "Can you tell the court about your father?" he asked. Naomi paused, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew exactly what it meant. "He worked there for over 25 years, she said. He never missed a shift. He never complained." Her voice remained even. "They said it was his fault." A brief silence followed, but it wasn't. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Days passed, arguments were made, evidence reviewed, and finally, the decision came. The courtroom stood as Judge Whitman returned. Naomi felt her breath slow, steady, controlled. Judge Whitman looked down at the documents before her, then up at the room. "This court finds that the employer failed to maintain safe working conditions," she said. "The evidence demonstrates prior knowledge of risk and failure to act accordingly." A pause. "The termination of Mr. David Carter was unjustified. Liability is established." Naomi didn't move. "The court awards full compensation to the Carter family." And just like that, it was done. The sound in the room returned slowly. Voices, movement, reactions. But Naomi remained still, because something deeper had just shifted. Not just the outcome, but the truth. Her father's name cleared, his life acknowledged, not erased. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, warmer, lighter. Naomi stood on the steps, looking out at the city. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying everything alone. Margaret stood beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did that," she said softly. Naomi shook her head. "We did." Edward nodded from nearby. "Justice is rarely given," he said. "It has to be pursued." Naomi looked at him. "And you helped me do that." Edward gave a small, approving nod. Life didn't transform overnight, but it began to heal. At home, the changes were visible. Lillian Carter sat up more often now, her energy slowly returning. Not fully, but enough. The constant weight of worry had lifted slightly, allowing her body to rest in a way it hadn't for years. One afternoon, she smiled. Truly smiled. For the first time in a long time. "I can breathe again," she said quietly. Naomi sat beside her, holding her hand. "We're okay," Naomi replied. And this time, it was true. Ethan Carter changed too. The tension that once filled his voice had softened, replaced by something more focused. Determination. "I'm going back," he said one morning, holding his backpack. Naomi looked at him. "Back where?" "School." He adjusted the strap over his shoulder. "I'm not wasting this." Naomi studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good." Maya, watching from the doorway, smiled brightly. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to build. Naomi returned to the Whitmore residence, not just as someone working, but as someone changing. Margaret handed her a folder one afternoon. Naomi opened it. University information, applications, programs. Her breath caught. "I thought," she began. Margaret smiled gently. "You paused," she said. "You didn't stop." Edward added from behind, "Consider it an investment, one you've already earned." Naomi looked at them, her voice quieter now. "I don't know how to thank you." Margaret shook her head. by going. That evening, Naomi stood once again in the garden. The same place, the same quiet, but everything felt different. Daniel joined her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You were strong in there." Naomi smiled slightly. "I didn't feel strong. That's usually when it matters most." She looked at him. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "You could have walked away." Daniel shook his head. "No," he said, "not from this." There was a pause. Then, more quietly, "Not from you." Naomi's expression shifted slightly. Not surprised, but aware. Daniel met her gaze, not rushed, not uncertain. "I respect you," he said, "what you've carried, what you've become." His voice remained steady. "And I care about you." The words settled between them, not heavy, not overwhelming, just honest. Naomi didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a breath. Then she smiled. Soft, but real. "I'm still figuring things out," she said. Daniel nodded. "I know." Another pause, "but I'm not going anywhere." The city lights stretched across the horizon. The past was still there. The struggle, the loss. But it no longer defined everything. Because now, there was space for something else. Justice, healing, and the beginning of something new. Chicago greeted Naomi Carter differently this time. The city hadn't changed. The same skyline stretched across the horizon. The same streets carried the same endless rhythm of movement. But Naomi had. The early autumn air was crisp, the kind that carried both endings and beginnings at once. Leaves drifted slowly across the campus pathways as students moved between buildings, conversations overlapping, futures unfolding in quiet, ordinary ways. Naomi stood at the entrance of the university. For a moment, she didn't move. Her fingers lightly brushed the strap of her bag, the same habit she had when she was unsure, but this time there was no hesitation behind it. Just awareness. She had imagined this moment before, but never like this. Naomi Carter, now 21, carried herself with a steadiness that came not from certainty, but from everything she had endured. Her posture remained straight, her movements deliberate, her presence quiet but grounded. Her deep brown eyes, once filled with distant dreams, now held something stronger. Clarity. She stepped forward. The campus felt alive. Students gathered in small groups, some laughing, some rushing, some simply sitting under trees with books open in front of them. Naomi walked through it all, not as someone chasing a future anymore, but as someone who had fought her way back to it. Her first class was in a large lecture hall. Inside, rows of seats curved upward, filling slowly as students settled in. Naomi chose a seat near the middle, not too close, not too far. As she opened her notebook, she paused briefly. Then, she wrote her name, Naomi Carter. This time, it felt different. Not like a dream, like something real. Her professor entered. Professor Helen Strauss. She was in her late 50s, tall and slightly stooped, with short gray hair and thin-framed glasses that rested low on her nose. Her voice carried authority, but not distance. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had spent decades guiding others, not controlling them. Her students knew her as demanding, but fair. "What you've been through before you got here," she began, "does not define your limits, it defines your strength." Naomi listened carefully, because she understood that, more than most. Weeks turned into months. Naomi adapted quickly, not because it was easy, but because she had learned how to persist. Long nights of studying replaced long nights of working. The exhaustion remained, but it had purpose now. Alicia Reynolds re-entered her life fully, not just through phone calls, but in person. Alicia had grown as well. She carried herself with more confidence now, her style sharper, her voice more certain. Her experiences at university had shaped her into someone who understood both opportunity and responsibility. "You're finally here," Alicia said one afternoon, smiling as they walked across campus. Naomi smiled back. "Took me a while." Alicia shook her head. "No, you took the long way." Naomi considered that, then nodded. Yeah. Their friendship no longer carried distance. It carried history. Outside of classes, Naomi began working on something else, something personal. The idea came quietly at first, then grew. She met with Grace Holloway, a woman in her early 40s who worked as a community advisor. Grace was of average height, with warm brown skin and short natural hair. Her presence was calm, her voice steady. She had spent years working with families affected by workplace injuries, shaped by her own past. Her father had suffered a similar fate years ago. "I want to help people like my father," Naomi said during their first meeting. Grace studied her. "Then don't start with money," she said. "Start with purpose." And so Naomi did. She began building a small initiative, something simple at first, connecting families with legal resources, sharing information, making sure no one faced what her family had faced. Alone. It wasn't big, but it mattered. At home, life had transformed. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Lillian Carter moved more easily now, her strength slowly returning. She still had difficult days, but they no longer defined her. She spent more time outside, sitting by the window watching the neighborhood with a quiet contentment. Ethan Carter had grown taller still, his confidence matching his height. School was no longer something he resisted. It was something he approached with intention. He studied harder, spoke with more focus, and for the first time began thinking about his own future. Maya Carter remained bright and curious, her laughter filling the home in ways that reminded Naomi of what had always been there. Even during the hardest times, the house felt different. Not because it had changed, but because they had. And then there was Daniel. Daniel Whitmore had remained a steady presence in Naomi's life, not overwhelming, not distant, just there, consistent. One evening, as winter approached and the air turned colder, he stood with Naomi in the same garden where so many of their conversations had begun. He looked the same, tall, composed, his dark hair neatly kept, but his expression had softened over time. Less guarded, more open. "You've built something," he said, referring to her initiative. Naomi shrugged lightly. "It's small." Daniel shook his head. "It's meaningful." There was a pause. Then Naomi said, "You stayed." Daniel looked at her. "I told you I would." She smiled, not uncertain, not hesitant, just real. The proposal wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It happened quietly, one evening under soft lights with the city stretching out behind them. Daniel spoke simply. "I don't want to build a life around comfort," he said. "I want to build it around something that matters." He met her eyes. "And you matter to me." Naomi didn't answer right away, because she didn't need to rush. She had learned that the right things didn't require urgency. They required truth, and this was true. "Yes," she said. The wedding followed months later. It wasn't large. It wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. It took place in a small outdoor space, surrounded by those who had been part of their journey. Margaret stood with quiet pride. Edward, composed but unmistakably approving. Alicia, smiling brighter than anyone. Lillian, seated comfortably, her eyes filled with emotion. Ethan and Maya, standing close, witnessing something they now understood. Naomi walked forward, not as someone who had been saved, but as someone who had endured. And chosen. As the ceremony ended, the city lights began to glow once more. Chicago. The same city where everything had once fallen apart. The same city where everything had come back together. Naomi stood still for a moment, looking out. Her life had changed. Not because of luck, not because of chance, but because she had held on. Through silence, through struggle, through everything. And when the door finally opened, she had walked through it. Sometimes, life does not reward effort right away. Sometimes, justice is delayed, voices are ignored, and good people are forced to carry more than they should. But this story reminds us of something important. Justice may come late, but it does not disappear. What is right still matters, even when no one is watching. In our daily lives, we may not face the same struggles as Naomi, but we all have moments where we choose how to treat others. A kind word, a fair decision, a willingness to stand up for someone who cannot speak for themselves. These small actions can change a life more than we realize. At the same time, this story is also a quiet reminder to reflect on ourselves. Have we ever stayed silent when we saw something unfair? Have we ever judged someone without knowing their full story? Growth begins when we are honest with these questions. Kindness is not weakness. Integrity is not invisible. And the people who choose to do right even when it is hard are the ones who quietly change the world. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope today. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the most. If you believe that doing the right thing still matters, type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your family, bring you strength in difficult times, and guide you toward better days. And if you want more stories that inspire, teach, and remind us of what truly matters, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.